Welcome to Storytales. Please like this video and subscribe to Storytales. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. The rhythmic clicking of tools against metal-filled Tony Marshall's auto shop, a sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. At 36, he built his reputation in Houston's automotive scene through unwavering dedication and honest work. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision as he leaned over the engine of Mrs. Henderson's Chevy, the afternoon sun streaming through the open garage door. "Almost done, Mrs. Henderson," he called out, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Just need to check the timing belt one more time." The elderly woman sat in the waiting area, her silver hair neatly styled despite the Houston humidity. "Take your time, Tony. I trust your work more than those dealership mechanics. You always do right by people." Tony smiled, though his eyes remained focused on the task at hand. Trust meant everything in his line of work, just as it did in marriage. 8 years with Morgan had taught him that, or at least he thought it had. The shop phone rang, and his apprentice Mike answered it. "Marshall's Auto Repair." "Yes, ma'am. One moment." He covered the receiver. "Hey, Tony, Morgan's on the line." Tony straightened up, wiping his hands on his work rag. The mention of his wife's name sent an uncomfortable twinge through his chest, a feeling he'd been experiencing more frequently lately. He took the phone, careful not to get grease on it. "Hey, babe, everything okay?" Morgan's voice came through slightly distorted, with the sound of traffic in the background. "Just letting you know I won't be home for dinner. Going out with some friends from work." Tony's jaw tightened. "Third time this week. Again? I thought we were going to try that new barbecue place tonight." "All right." A pause. "Rain check? I really need this time with the girls. You understand, don't you?" Before he could respond, the distinct sound of a male laugh carried through the phone. Morgan quickly spoke over it. "Got to go. Don't wait up." The line went dead before Tony could say goodbye. He stared at the phone for a moment, that familiar unease growing stronger in his gut. Mike watched him with concern. "Everything all right, boss?" Tony hung up the phone with deliberate care. "Fine. Let's finish up Mrs. Henderson's car." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of oil changes and brake repairs. Tony threw himself into his work, finding comfort in the predictability of engines. Cars made sense. If something was wrong, you could diagnose it, fix it, test it. Marriage, he was learning, wasn't nearly so straightforward. The BY closing time. The setting sun painted the shop in shades of orange and red. Tony sat at his desk, reviewing the day's invoices, but his mind kept wandering to Morgan. The changes in her behavior had been subtle at first, like hairline cracks in an engine block, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. That IT had started 3 months ago. The constant texting was the first sign, her phone becoming an extension of her hand. She'd angle the screen away from him when he walked by, quickly switching apps or turning it face down. Then came the girls' nights that seemed to multiply like rabbits and the new clothes that she never wore around him. Tony closed the invoice book and locked up the shop. The drive home took him past their favorite date night restaurant, now gathering dust in their routine. When was the last time they'd had a real conversation? One that didn't involve Morgan, checking her phone every 2 minutes or making excuses to be somewhere else. The house was dark when he pulled into the driveway, gravel crunching under his truck's tires. Inside, the silence felt heavy, accusatory. Tony moved through the rooms, turning on lights, trying to make the space feel less empty. A half-empty wine glass sat on the kitchen counter, Morgan's liquid courage, becoming more frequent these days that he opened the fridge, staring at the containers of leftover chili he'd made 2 days ago. Morgan used to love his cooking, would brag about it to her friends. Now she barely touched her plate when she was home for dinner, the sound of his phone ringing cut through the silence. For a moment, hope flared. Maybe Morgan was calling to say she'd be home early. But the caller ID showed Mike's name. "Boss, sorry to bother you at home, but that parts order for the Rodriguez truck came in wrong. They sent brake pads for an 85 model instead of 95. Tony welcomed the distraction. "I'll call the supplier first thing tomorrow. We still have time before Rodriguez needs it back." "Thanks, boss. And hey," Mike hesitated. "You know you can talk to me if something's eating at you, right? Known you 15 years now." "Appreciate it, Mike." Tony's voice was gruff with emotion he refused to show. "See you tomorrow." After hanging up, Tony walked upstairs to their bedroom. Morgan's perfume lingered in the air, the scent different from what she used to wear. He opened her dresser drawer, telling himself he was just putting away laundry. The sight of unfamiliar lingerie, tags still attached, made his stomach turn. He'd never seen her wear any of it. The sound of a text notification made him jump. His phone showed a message from Mrs. Henderson. "Car's running perfectly. Thank you for always being so thorough, Tony." He smiled despite himself. At least in his work, things still made sense. He could still trust in the solid reality of metal and machinery, in the satisfaction of a job well done. The rest of the evening passed slowly. Tony tried watching TV, but couldn't focus on the game. He cleaned the kitchen, organized his tools for tomorrow. Anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from wandering to where Morgan might be, or who she might be with that AT-11. He heard her car pull up. The front door opened, bringing with it the smell of cigarette smoke. Another new development, since Morgan had always hated smoking. Her heels clicked on the hardwood as she made her way to the kitchen, humming slightly. "Oh!" She startled when she saw him sitting at the counter. "I thought you'd be in bed." Tony studied her carefully. Her makeup was touched up, but her lipstick was gone. Her hair had been restyled. The dress, another new one, had a slight wrinkle on the side, as if it had been bunched up. "Had some paperwork to catch up on," he lied, watching her movements. "Good time with the girls?" Morgan busied herself getting a glass of water, not quite meeting his eyes. "Yeah, just what I needed. Though I'm exhausted now. Think I'll head up to bed." "Morgan." His voice made her pause at the bottom of the stairs. "Is everything okay? With us?" She turned, and for a moment he caught something in her expression. Guilt? Fear? But it was gone so fast he might have imagined it. "Of course, honey." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Everything's fine. You worry too much." Tony watched her climb the stairs, listened to her go through her bedtime routine. The distance between them felt like a chasm, growing wider with each passing day. In the quiet of their kitchen, he made a decision. Starting tomorrow, he'd pay closer attention. Something was wrong with his marriage, and like any good mechanic, he needed to diagnose the problem before he could fix it, or before it destroyed everything he'd built his life around. The next few weeks at Marshall's Auto Repair took on a different rhythm. Tony started tracking patterns, his mechanic's mind breaking down Morgan's behavior like he would diagnose a complex engine problem. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons became his focus, the times when Morgan's absences were most consistent. "Looking a bit distracted there, boss," Mike commented one morning as Tony checked the scheduling book for the third time. "That timing chain giving you trouble?" Tony shook his head, closing the book with more force than necessary. "Just planning ahead. We've got the Rodriguez truck coming in next week." But his mind wasn't on the Rodriguez truck. It was on Morgan's phone, which she'd left on the kitchen counter that morning while showering, a rare mistake on her part. He'd seen a text notification flash across the screen. "Can't wait to see you today." Same time, the sender's name had been a simple J. That evening, Tony sat in his garage, methodically cleaning his tools while piecing together the puzzle. Morgan's me time always fell on the same days. Her phone was now permanently set to vibrate, notifications hidden from the lock screen. She'd changed her email password last week, claiming she'd seen some suspicious activity. The sound of Morgan's car pulling into the driveway broke his concentration. She walked into the garage, her designer heels clicking on the concrete. "There you are," she said, her voice carrying that artificial cheerfulness he'd grown to hate. "I picked up dinner from that Italian place you like." Tony placed his wrench back in its designated spot. "Thought you had yoga on Thursdays." A flicker of something anxiety crossed her face. "Oh, class was canceled. Instructor got sick." "That's too bad." Tony kept his voice neutral. "Guess that means you can join me for lunch at the shop next Thursday instead?" Morgan's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, honey, Thursdays are my errands day. You know that." "Right. The errands." Tony stood up, wiping his hands. "Funny thing is, I drove by the yoga studio today. Lot was full. Class seemed to be going strong." The color drained from Morgan's face, but she recovered quickly. "I'm at the evening class. The morning instructor is sick." "You told me last week you switched to morning classes because the evening ones were too crowded." The silence between them crackled with tension. Morgan's hand went to her phone, a nervous habit she'd developed. "Are you checking up on me?" Her voice took on an edge of indignation. Spying on me now? Wouldn't need to if you just tell me the truth. Tony moved past her into the house. But I guess that's too much to ask these days. What's that supposed to mean? Morgan followed him into the kitchen, her heels striking the floor like angry exclamation points. Tony turned to face her, noting how she kept the kitchen island between them. It means I'm not stupid, Morgan. Something's going on, and we both know it. Nothing is going on. She threw her hands up. God, you're being paranoid. This is exactly why I need time to myself. You're suffocating me. The Italian takeout sat forgotten on the counter as they faced each other across the kitchen. Tony noticed Morgan's hands trembling slightly as she gripped her phone. Suffocating you? His voice was dangerously quiet. 8 years of marriage, and now I'm suffocating you? Morgan's phone buzzed. She glanced at it reflexively, and that same soft smile he'd noticed weeks ago touched her lips for a split second before she caught herself. I need some air. She grabbed her purse. Don't wait up. Tony watched her leave, listening to her car start and pull away. Once the sound faded, he walked upstairs to their home office. Morgan had left her laptop open, another careless mistake. The browser was still logged into her email that he hesitated for a moment, his conscience warring with his need to know the truth. Then he remembered that smile when her phone buzzed, and he began to search. The evidence was there in fragments. Emails deleted but not emptied from the trash folder, calendar entries with vague labels like appointment and meeting, all falling on Tuesdays and Thursdays. One email caught his attention. A confirmation for a hotel reservation downtown. Dated for next Tuesday. Tony closed the laptop and walked to their bedroom. He opened Morgan's side of the closet, finally allowing himself to notice what he'd been trying to ignore. The new dresses, the expensive lingerie, the shoes that she never wore around him. Everything pointed to one conclusion, but he needed absolute proof. He needed to be certain before he acted. When Morgan came home late that night, Tony was already in bed, pretending to sleep. He listened to her shower, smelling an unfamiliar cologne mixing with the steam. His hands clenched the sheets as he fought the urge to confront her right then. No. He needed to be smart about this. Needed to catch her in a way she couldn't deny or explain away. Tuesday was 5 days away. He'd wait, watch, and plan. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and forced normalcy. Tony went through the motions at work, his mind constantly running scenarios. Morgan seemed oblivious to his inner turmoil, continuing her routine of secret texts and transparent lies. Sunday night, she announced she had an important client meeting on Tuesday afternoon. Tony nodded, watching her choose her outfit, a new red dress he'd never seen before. Hope the meeting goes well, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Morgan paused in front of her mirror, smoothing the dress against her body. Thanks, honey. It's really important for my career. Tony turned away before she could see his expression. Important for her career. Right. He'd see just how important on Tuesday. Monday dragged by, each hour feeling like a year. Tony threw himself into his work, rebuilding in transmission with such intensity that Mike asked if he was trying to set a speed record. Just focus, Tony replied, not looking up from the engine block. Sometimes you need to strip everything down to see what's really broken. Tuesday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Morgan kissed him goodbye, her lips barely brushing his cheek before she hurried out the door. Tony watched her leave, knowing that in a few hours, everything would change. That he had a plan. A simple one, really. He'd close the shop early, drive downtown, and find out exactly what kind of client meeting his wife was having. He worked through the morning appointments. Tony's mind kept drifting to the hotel confirmation he'd seen. The Westbrook Hotel, one of Houston's more discreet upscale establishments. Perfect for secret meetings. Early afternoon. His hands were steady, but his heart felt like it might burst from his chest. He told Mike he wasn't feeling well and needed to close early. You sure you're okay to drive, boss? Mike's concern was evident. You've been off all week. Tony managed a tight smile. Just need to take care of something. Lock up for me. As he climbed into his truck, Tony caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. The face looking back at him was hard, determined. Whatever he found today would change everything. But he was Tony Marshall, and he faced his problems head on. He started the engine, his decision made. It was time to find out exactly what Morgan did during her me time. The Westbrook Hotel rose before Tony like a glass and steel monument to secrets. He parked his truck in the public garage across the street, his mechanic's eyes automatically noting a black Mercedes with custom wheels in one of the reserved spots. The kind of car that would look out of place in his neighborhood. Tony checked his watch. 2:45 p.m. Morgan's client meeting would be in full swing. His fingers gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white as memories of happier times flashed through his mind. Their wedding day, Morgan's smile as they bought their first house, quiet Sunday mornings sharing coffee, and dreams all lies. Every moment tainted by whatever he was about to discover. The walk to their house took 15 minutes. Tony had decided against confronting them at the hotel. Too public, too many variables. Instead, he confirmed his suspicions and now waited. Morgan always came home after these meetings to shower and change before her regular evening routine. Today, that routine would change forever. Their street looked different somehow, as if the weight of his knowledge had altered the very landscape of his life. He noticed Morgan's car wasn't in the driveway yet, but that familiar black Mercedes was parked half a block down, its tinted windows hiding its occupant. That Tony's jaw clenched. The bastard had followed her home, that he walked past his front door, making a show of checking his phone, then circled around through their neighbor's yard. The spare key hidden in the garage gave him silent entry through the back door. The house was quiet, but not empty quiet. He could hear movement upstairs, soft footsteps, a laugh that made his blood boil. Morgan's voice drifted down, playful and intimate in a way she hadn't been with him in months. Tony moved up the stairs with deliberate calm, each step bringing more clarity. The bedroom door was partially open, spilling afternoon light into the hallway. Morgan's red dress lay crumpled on the floor outside. Time seemed to slow as Tony reached the door. He could turn back now, pretend he hadn't seen what he was about to see. But that wasn't who he was. Tony Marshall faced problems head-on. No matter how much they hurt, he pushed the door open. The scene burned itself into his memory with brutal clarity. Morgan was on their bed. The bed they'd bought together after their 5th anniversary, with a man Tony had never seen before. They were tangled in the sheets, their bodies moving together in the most intimate betrayal possible. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then Morgan's eyes met his, widening in horror as recognition dawned. The man, tall, well-built, probably early 40s, was still moving, unaware of their audience. That Morgan's scream shattered the moment. She scrambled backward, clutching sheets to her naked body, her face draining of color. "Tony! Oh, God, Tony!" The man finally realized something was wrong and turned, revealing a handsome, arrogant face now twisted in shock. He opened his mouth to speak, but Tony was already moving. The first punch caught the man square in the jaw, the impact reverberating up Tony's arm. Years of working with heavy machinery had built strength that sent the stranger sprawling off the bed. Tony grabbed him by his expensive shirt collar before he could recover. "You think you can walk into my house and do this?" Tony's voice was barely recognizable, thick with rage and disgust. He slammed the man against the wall, following up with another punch to the gut that left him gasping. "Tony, please!" Morgan was sobbing now, still wrapped in their sheets. "Stop! You'll kill him." "Shut up, Morgan." Tony didn't even look at her, his focus entirely on the man who dared touch his wife. "You're just as pathetic as he is." The stranger, Jack Ellison, as Tony would later learn, tried to fight back, throwing a wild punch that Tony easily dodged. Tony responded with a devastating combination that sent Jack crashing to the floor, blood streaming from his nose. "Listen, man," Jack gasped, raising his hands. "We can talk about this." "Talk." Tony grabbed him by the throat. "Like how you talked your way into my wife's pants? Like how you talked her into betraying everything we built?" Morgan had scrambled off the bed, clutching a sheet around herself. "Tony, it's not what you think." "Not what I think." Tony laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I think it's exactly what it looks like. I think you're both exactly what you appear to be. Cheaters, liars, garbage." He dragged Jack toward the stairs, the other man stumbling and protesting as he tried to grab his scattered clothes. Tony was relentless, his grip iron tight as he hauled Jack down the steps. Each impact of Jack's body against the stairs felt like justice. Tony threw open the front door and hurled Jack onto the lawn, watching with grim satisfaction as the man sprawled half-naked on the grass. "If I ever see you near my house again," Tony's voice was deadly calm, "what happened today will feel like a gentle warning." He turned back inside, leaving Jack to scramble to his car in his underwear, blood still dripping from his face. The Mercedes peeled away from the curb. Tires squealing in retreat, Morgan stood at the top of the stairs, now wearing a robe, her face streaked with tears and mascara. "Tony, please, let me explain." "Explain?" He cut her off, his voice sharp enough to make her flinch. "There's nothing to explain. You have 1 hour to pack your things and get out. You're done here." "But Tony, our marriage. He laughed again, the sound harsh and broken. "You killed that the moment you let him into our bed. 1 hour, Morgan. Anything left after that goes in the trash." He walked into the kitchen, ignoring her pleas and sobs. With mechanical precision, he pulled out a beer from the fridge and sat at the counter, his back to the stairs. He could hear her moving around upstairs, crying and throwing things into bags. Tony took a long pull from his beer, his knuckles beginning to sting where they'd connected with Jack's face. 8 years of marriage, demolished in an afternoon. He thought about all the signs he'd noticed, all the red flags he'd filed away. Part of him wanted to rage, to break things, to scream at the unfairness of it all, but Tony Marshall wasn't built that way. He'd faced this betrayal like he faced everything else in his life head-on, with determination and grit. Morgan had made her choice. Now she'd live with the consequences upstairs. He could hear her phone ringing, probably Jack checking on her. Tony's grip tightened on his beer bottle, but he remained seated. Let her deal with her lover now. She'd made her bed literally and figuratively, and now she'd lie in it. The hour passed slowly, marked by the sound of drawers opening and closing, hangers scraping across rails, and Morgan's occasional sobs. Tony sat perfectly still, his beer long since warm and forgotten. As his marriage crumbled around him, finally, Morgan appeared at the bottom of the stairs, 2 large suitcases and a duffel bag in tow. Her face was puffy from crying, her carefully applied makeup now a tragic mask. I'll come back for the rest of my things," she said quietly. Tony didn't turn around. "Anything left here tomorrow goes in the garbage. Just like our vows did." He heard her sharp intake of breath, followed by the sound of wheels rolling across hardwood. The front door opened, then closed. A car started, probably an Uber, since Jack's Mercedes was long gone. Only when he was sure she was gone did Tony finally move. He walked upstairs to their bedroom, his bedroom now, and stripped the bed with mechanical efficiency, stuffing the sheets into a garbage bag. The room still smelled of sex and Morgan's perfume, a combination that made his stomach turn. Opening the windows, Tony let the cool evening air flow in. He'd sleep on the couch tonight. Tomorrow he'd buy a new mattress, new sheets, new everything. Tonight, though, he needed to make some calls. Morgan had destroyed their marriage, but Tony would make damn sure she didn't destroy him. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through their shared contacts. It was time everyone knew exactly who Morgan Marshall really was. Dawn broke over Houston, painting the sky in shades of red that matched Tony's mood. He hadn't slept, spending the night on the couch while his mind replayed yesterday's events on an endless loop. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen as he made his first call of the day. "Mike, need you to open the shop today." Tony's voice was rough from lack of sleep. "Got some personal business to handle." "Everything okay, boss?" Mike's concern carried through the phone. "You've been off lately." "Morgan's gone." Tony's grip tightened on his coffee mug. "Caught her cheating yesterday." The silence on the other end stretched for a moment. "Jesus, Tony. I'm sorry, man. You need anything?" "Yeah. Need you to spread the word at the shop. Anyone asks, tell them exactly what happened. No sugarcoating. You got it, boss. Want me to come by after work? Help you clear out her stuff?" Tony walked to the window, watching the sunrise. "No, this is something I need to do myself." After hanging up, Tony climbed the stairs to their bedroom. His bedroom now. Morgan's clothes still hung in the closet, her perfumes and makeup scattered across the vanity. Everything that had once been familiar now felt toxic. The doorbell rang as he was pulling garbage bags from under the sink. Through the front window, he saw Morgan standing on the porch, wearing yesterday's clothes and looking like she hadn't slept either. Tony opened the door, but blocked the entrance with his body. Morgan's eyes were red and puffy. Her designer outfit wrinkled from spending the night, who knows where. "Tony, please," she started, her voice trembling. "Can we just talk about this?" "Talk." Tony's laugh was harsh. "Like how you talk to me about your client meetings? Or how about your yoga classes? I know I messed up." Morgan reached for his arm, but Tony stepped back. "But 8 years of marriage has to mean something." "It meant something to me." Tony's voice was ice cold. "Right up until I found you screwing another man in our bed. That was a mistake. Jack doesn't mean anything to me." "Jack!" Tony cut her off. "So that's his name? Good to know who I knocked around yesterday." Morgan's face paled. "He's talking about pressing charges, Tony. Let him try. I've got witnesses who'll testify. I found him in my house, in my bed with my wife." Tony smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Wonder how that'll play out in court? Why are you being so cruel?" Tears started falling down Morgan's cheeks. "This isn't like you. And spreading your legs for another man wasn't like you. Guess we're both full of surprises." Tony reached behind the door and grabbed a garbage bag. "Here's some of your stuff. The rest will be on the lawn in an hour. You can't just throw my things out." "Actually, I can. House is in my name, remember? You insisted on keeping your money separate when we bought it." Tony's smile grew colder. "Funny how that worked out." Morgan's tears stopped abruptly. "Fine. I'll call the police." "Go ahead. I'm sure they'd love to hear how you and your boyfriend were trespassing in my house." Tony leaned forward slightly. "Or maybe they'd be interested in those pills I found in your purse last month. The ones without a prescription." Morgan's face went white. "You wouldn't." "Try me. You've got 1 hour to get your stuff before it hits the curb." "And Morgan," he caught her eyes, "better hope Jack's worth it, because after today, you're dead to me." He shut the door in her face, ignoring her renewed protests. Through the window, he watched her pace the porch for a few minutes before storming off to her car. Tony spent the next hour methodically packing Morgan's belongings into garbage bags. Designer clothes, expensive shoes, jewelry, everything went in except what he'd given her over the years. Those items he set aside for donation. The phone rang constantly. Morgan's friends, her family, mutual acquaintances. Tony answered each call with brutal honesty. "Hey, Lisa. Yeah, Morgan won't be at book club anymore." "Why?" "Because I caught her cheating yesterday. With some guy named Jack. Feel free to spread the word." "Mr. Martinez, sorry to hear about your daughter's choices. But no, I won't be reconsidering." Morgan made her bed literally, and now she can lie in it. "Dave?" "Yeah, you might want to ask your wife about those girls' nights with Morgan. Turns out they weren't all going to yoga." By noon, the front lawn was covered with black garbage bags. Tony stood in the doorway, watching as Morgan pulled up in her car. A police cruiser right behind her. The officers approached cautiously. Tony recognized them from working on their patrol cars. "Mr. Marshall." Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. "We got a call about a domestic dispute." "No dispute here, officer." Tony gestured to the bags. "Just returning my cheating ex-wife's property. Found her with another man in my house yesterday." Rodriguez glanced at his partner, then back at Morgan. "Ma'am, is this true?" Morgan's face flushed. "That's not. It's complicated." "Actually, it's simple," Tony interrupted. "House is in my name. I'm removing an unwanted person's belongings from my property. Everything she owns is there, unharmed." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "Ma'am, if the house is in his name, he has the right to remove your belongings. As long as nothing is damaged. This is a civil matter." "But he assaulted Jack." Morgan protested. "The man I found trespassing in my house, in my bed." Tony raised an eyebrow. "Want to file that report, Morgan? Tell them all about how your boyfriend broke into my house." Morgan's mouth snapped shut. The officers exchanged knowing looks. "Ma'am, we suggest you take your belongings and handle this through proper legal channels," Rodriguez's partner said firmly. "Unless you want to file a trespassing report about yesterday's incident." Morgan's shoulders slumped in defeat. "No, I'll just take my things." Tony watched from the doorway as Morgan and the officers loaded her belongings into her car. Each bag represented another piece of their life together. now tainted and worthless. A.S. Morgan prepared to leave. She tried one last time. Tony, please. We can work through this. Go to counseling, start over. Like you worked through it with Jack. Tony's voice carried across the lawn. No second chances, Morgan. Not for this. He closed the door on her final plea, then walked to the kitchen and pulled out his phone. Time to make sure everyone in their social circle knew exactly what kind of person Morgan Marshall really was. The destruction of Morgan's life had begun, and Tony wouldn't stop until she felt even a fraction of the pain she'd caused him. The weekly neighborhood barbecue at the Wilsons' house had been a tradition for years. Tony hadn't planned to attend this Saturday, but Dan Wilson personally came to his shop to insist. People are talking, Tony, Dan said, leaning against a workbench. Better to face them head on. Let them hear the truth from you. Tony wiped his hands on a shop rag, considering. Not really in a social mood, Dan. Morgan's been telling her version to anyone who'll listen. Dan's expression hardened. Claims you were controlling, neglectful. Says that's why she turned to Jack. The wrench in Tony's hand creaked under his grip. That's so. Nobody who knows you believes it. But you need to set the record straight. That evening, Tony walked into the Wilsons' backyard, a six-pack of beer in hand. Conversations stuttered to a halt as heads turned. He could feel the weight of their stares, see the questions in their eyes. Lisa Cooper, Morgan's closest friend in the neighborhood, approached first. Tony, we've been so worried. Morgan told us what happened. Did she tell you about screwing her boyfriend in my bed? Tony's voice carried across the yard. Or did she skip that part? The silence turned heavy. Lisa's face flushed red. She said you were having problems. The only problem was Morgan keeping her legs closed. Tony cracked open a beer. But hey, maybe you could tell me more about those yoga classes you two went to. Funny how you both came home with different stories about them. Lisa's mouth opened and closed soundlessly before she retreated. Around the yard, people shifted uncomfortably, whispers starting to circulate. Betty Wilson appeared at Tony's side with a plate of food. Honey, I'm so sorry. We had no idea. Not your fault, Betty. Tony accepted the plate. Morgan fooled a lot of people, including me. Throughout the evening, the story spread like wildfire. Tony answered questions directly, sparing no details. When Morgan's name came up, he made sure everyone knew exactly what she'd done. Hey, Tony. Mark Reynolds, another neighbor, pulled him aside. Listen, man, Morgan came by our place yesterday, asking to stay with us for a few days. And Katie told her no, said we don't support cheaters. Mark clasped Tony's shoulder. Just wanted you to know we've got your back. The next week brought more revelations. Tony learned that several of their friends had suspected something, but hadn't wanted to get involved. He made sure they felt the full weight of their silence at the local coffee shop. He ran into Rebecca, Morgan's coworker. She tried to hurry past, but Tony called out to her. Rebecca, how's the office? Morgan still taking those long lunches with her clients? Rebecca froze, then turned slowly. The other customers watched with undisguised interest. Tony, I didn't know for sure. But you suspected? Tony's voice was pleasant, but his eyes were hard. All those times she came back late, lipstick smeared, clothes wrinkled. Must have been some intense business meetings. She made me promise not to say anything. Rebecca's voice quivered. Said it would ruin everything if anyone found out. Well, she was right about that. Tony smiled coldly. How's the office treating her now that everyone knows the truth? Rebecca looked away. She took a leave of absence. After the rumors started. Rumors? Tony laughed. You mean the truth? Feel free to share it. In fact, I insist. The destruction of Morgan's reputation continued methodically. Tony made sure every social circle, every mutual friend, every business contact knew the full story. He answered calls and messages with brutal honesty, never embellishing but never softening the truth either. That Morgan's attempts to maintain her social standing crumbled. Her usual lunch spots became uncomfortable as whispers followed her. Friends stopped returning her calls. Invitations dried up. One evening, Tony's phone rang. Morgan's mother. Anthony, please. Patricia's voice trembled. She's my daughter. She made a terrible mistake, but a mistake is forgetting to pay a bill. Patricia. Tony cut her off. What Morgan did was a choice. Multiple choices over months. She's saying you drove her to it. That you were cold, distant, really? Tony's voice sharpened. Was I cold when I worked 60-hour weeks to buy her that car she wanted? Distant when I sat through every mindless social event she dragged me to? Tell me, Patricia, did she mention how many times she was working late while spreading her legs for Jack? A sharp intake of breath. Anthony, no, you don't get to act shocked. Your daughter destroyed our marriage. Now she gets to live with the consequences. Tony's grip on the phone tightened. And if you're smart, you'll stop trying to defend her. Unless you want people asking how you raised a daughter who thinks cheating is acceptable. The calls from Morgan's family stopped after that. Tony heard through the grapevine that even they had started distancing themselves, embarrassed by the scandal, to AT Church, where Morgan had always been active in community events. Her absence was noted. Tony attended regularly, accepting condolences and sharing his story when asked. Such a shame, Mrs. Peterson clucked after service. She seemed like such a good Christian woman. Appearances can be deceiving. Tony straightened his tie, just like those long prayers she used to say while planning her next meetup with Jack. The whispers spread through the congregation. Morgan's name was quietly removed from committee lists and volunteer rosters, even at her job, where she'd built a successful career in real estate. The fallout was inevitable. Tony ran into her broker, Richard, at the gas station. Tough situation, Tony. Richard shook his head. Morgan was one of my best agents. Was? Client trust is everything in our business. Once word got around, Richard shrugged. Let's just say her numbers have taken a hit. Tony filled his tank, watching the numbers climb. Funny how actions have consequences, isn't it? She's talking about relocating. Richard hesitated. Starting fresh somewhere else. Running away. Tony replaced the pump. Seems about right for her. Always looking for the easy way out. As summer turned to fall, Morgan's carefully constructed social world lay in ruins. The women who'd once been her closest friends crossed the street to avoid her. Party invitations stopped. Her usual salon found excuses not to book her appointments. One rainy Tuesday, Tony spotted her eating alone at their old favorite restaurant. She sat in a corner booth, her designer clothes still perfect, but her posture defeated. When she saw him, she quickly asked for her check. The waiter approached Tony's table. Mr. Marshall, your usual table? Actually, Tony smiled, watching Morgan hurry past. I think I'll take that corner booth. Seems it just opened up. Morgan's world was crumbling, piece by piece, relationship by relationship. And Tony made sure he was there to witness every moment of her fall from grace. Tony sat across from his lawyer, Jim Baker, reviewing divorce papers in the dated but comfortable office. Morning light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the mahogany desk. She's asking for half of everything, Jim said, shuffling through documents. Claims she contributed to the growth of your business through, and I quote, emotional and social support. Tony's laugh was sharp. Emotional support? While she was screwing around with Jack. Speaking of Jack Ellison, Jim leaned forward. He's dropped any talk of assault charges. Seems he doesn't want his name appearing in official documents. Married man, is he? With 3 kids and a seat on the board of his company. Jim smiled thinly. Amazing how quickly people like that disappear when their reputations are at stake. The door opened, and Jim's secretary poked her head in. Mr. Marshall? Morgan's here for the mediation. Tony straightened his tie. Let's get this over with. Morgan entered with her lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman named Rachel Klein. The contrast between Morgan's current appearance and her usual polished look was striking. Dark circles under her eyes, designer outfit slightly wrinkled, hands shaking as she sat down. Before we begin, Rachel started. My client would like to discuss the possibility of reconciliation. Not happening. Tony's voice was flat. We're here to divorce, not waste time. Morgan flinched. Tony, please. We could try counseling. The only counseling you need is to learn to keep your legs closed. Tony turned to Jim. Can we stick to business? Rachel's face tightened. Mr. Marshall, such hostile language is completely justified, Jim interrupted. Now, about these demands for half the business assets, the mediation deteriorated quickly. Morgan's claims of emotional neglect met Tony's cold recitation of facts. Dates, times, phone records, hotel receipts. Each piece of evidence made her shrink further into her chair. You've been tracking me? Morgan's voice quivered. Didn't need to. You left a trail a blind man could follow. Tony pulled out his phone. Want to explain these credit card charges at the Westbrook Hotel? Pretty expensive for yoga classes. Rachel tried to regain control. My client's personal choices, while regrettables. Tony leaned forward. How about criminal? Those prescription pills in her purse didn't have her name on them. Want to discuss that? Morgan's face went white. Rachel whispered urgently in her ear. We're willing to revise our demands. Rachel announced stiffly. Jim smiled. I thought you might be. The next hour was a methodical dismantling of Morgan's claims. The house was in Tony's name. The business predated their marriage. Her contributions? Minimal, especially compared to her expenditures. Fine. Morgan's voice cracked. I'll sign whatever you want. Just, can we keep this quiet? Tony stood, gathering his papers. Bit late for that, isn't it? Don't worry, though. Everyone already knows what you are. The court hearing 2 weeks later was brief, but brutal. Judge Martinez, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, reviewed the evidence with increasing disapproval. Mrs. Marshall, you claim your husband was emotionally unavailable. The judge peered over her glasses. Yet these credit card statements show regular date nights, vacations, gifts. It wasn't enough, Morgan tried to explain. I needed to sleep with another man in your marital bed? Judge Martinez's tone could have frozen fire. While your husband worked to provide the lifestyle you enjoyed? Morgan's lawyer attempted to intervene. Your Honor, my client acknowledges her mistakes. Mistakes? Tony's voice carried across the courtroom. A mistake is forgetting our anniversary. She made conscious choices, over and over. The judge nodded. Indeed, Mr. Marshall, the house and business remains solely yours. Mrs. Marshall, given your infidelity and the prenuptial agreement you signed, your claims to these assets are denied. But where am I supposed to go? Morgan's composure finally broke. I can't afford. Perhaps Mr. Ellison can help. The judge's voice dripped sarcasm. Though I understand, he's suddenly unreachable. Funny how that works. Later, in the courthouse parking lot, Morgan made one last attempt. She caught up to Tony as he walked to his truck. I have nothing left, she pleaded. My job's falling apart. My friends won't talk to me. Even my parents are ashamed. You've taken everything. Tony turned slowly. I took nothing. You threw it all away, piece by piece, every time you spread your legs for Jack. I made a mistake, no? Tony's voice was steel. You made a choice. Every time you lied about working late. Every time you pretended to go to yoga. Every time you let him touch you. Those were choices. Tears streaked Morgan's makeup. What am I supposed to do now? Not my problem. Tony opened his truck door. Maybe try keeping your clothes on around married men. Seems like a good start. He drove away, leaving Morgan standing in the parking lot, her perfectly manicured hands clutching divorce papers that left her with nothing but regrets. That evening, Tony sat in his home office, reviewing the final divorce decree. 8 years of marriage, reduced to a stack of papers and a judge's signature. His phone buzzed with a text from Mike. Heard about court. Drink tonight? Tony smiled slightly. Throughout everything, his friend had stood by him. Rain check. Got plans? Those plans involved a bottle of whiskey and the last box of Morgan's photos, still sitting in the garage. One by one, he fed them into the fire pit in the backyard, watching as the flames consumed images of happier times. The woman in those photos was gone, replaced by someone he now saw clearly. Morgan had destroyed their marriage, but Tony had made sure she lost everything else in the process. No friends, no reputation, no assets, no respect. That as the last photo curled and blackened in the flames, Tony raised his glass in a mock toast. Morgan had chosen her path. Now she could walk it alone. 3 months after the divorce, Tony's auto shop had never been busier. He'd landed several new corporate contracts, expanding his business beyond anything Morgan had seen during their marriage. The irony wasn't lost on him. Another fleet maintenance deal? Mike whistled as he reviewed the paperwork. Boss, we're going to need to hire more mechanics. Already ahead of you. Tony wiped his hands on a shop rag, studying the BMW he'd just finished servicing. Called the trade school. Got 3 apprentices starting next month. The bell over the door chimed. Tony looked up to see Lisa Cooper, Morgan's former best friend, shuffling awkwardly into the shop. "Tony? Got a minute?" She glanced around nervously. "It's about Morgan." Tony straightened, his expression hardening. "Unless her car needs work, I'm not interested. She's living in that old apartment complex on Wilson Street." Lisa pressed on. "You know, the one with all the code violations? She can't get approved for anything better because her reputation's shot?" Tony's laugh was cold. "Funny how actions have consequences." Lisa twisted her hands. She lost her real estate license. Apparently, some clients complained about her behavior with their husbands during house showings. "Let me guess. Private showings?" Tony started cleaning his tools with methodical precision. "Sounds like a pattern." She tried calling Jack, but his numbers disconnected. His wife found out, and Lisa. Tony's voice cut through her rambling. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because she's falling apart." Lisa's voice cracked. "She drinks all day, barely eats. Yesterday, I saw her at the grocery store wearing the same clothes as 3 days ago." Tony placed his wrench back in its spot with deliberate care. "And that's my problem, Hal. You destroyed her life." "No." Tony turned his eyes hard. "She destroyed her life. Every lie, every betrayal, every time she spread her legs for Jack. Those were her choices. I just made sure everyone knew about them." She's talking about moving back in with her parents in Dallas. "Running away." Tony shook his head. "Typical Morgan. When things get tough, she looks for someone else to save her." The shop phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Tony answered it, his voice shifting to professional mode. "Marshall's Auto Repair." "Yes, Mr. Rodriguez. Your fleet's scheduled for next Tuesday." He turned his back on Lisa. "We've expanded our services since last time. Let me tell you about our new maintenance packages." Lisa stood there for a moment longer, then left without another word. Through the window, Tony watched her drive away in her perfectly maintained SUV, the one he'd been servicing for years at a discount because of Morgan. Mike approached cautiously. "You okay, boss?" "Better than okay." Tony smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just thinking about karma." That evening, Tony drove home past Morgan's new apartment building. The place was a far cry from their former home. Peeling paint, broken shutters, cars on blocks in the parking lot. Through a ground floor window, he caught a glimpse of a familiar figure sitting alone in a dimly lit room. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I miss you. Please talk to me." Tony deleted the message without responding and blocked the number. It wasn't the first time she'd tried reaching out from a new phone, and it wouldn't be the last at AT home. He sorted through his mail, pausing at an envelope from his lawyer. Inside was confirmation that Morgan's final attempt to appeal the divorce settlement had been rejected. Along with it was a note about her mounting legal fees. The doorbell rang. Tony opened it to find Morgan's mother, Patricia, standing on his porch. She'd aged years in the past few months, her once perfect appearance showing signs of strain. "Anthony, please." Her voice trembled. "She's not eating. She lost her job, her friends, everything. That's what happens when you're exposed as a cheater." Tony leaned against the doorframe. "Shouldn't you be having this conversation with Jack?" "Oh, wait, he's too busy saving his marriage and career to care about his former mistress. She made a mistake." "A mistake." Tony's voice rose. "A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill. She made conscious choices, Patricia. Every time she lied about working late. Every time she met him at that hotel. Every time she let him into our bed." Patricia flinched. "She's still my daughter. Then you deal with her." "I'm done." Tony started closing the door. "And Patricia? Next time she needs someone to blame for her problems, tell her to look in a mirror." After shutting the door, Tony poured himself a whiskey and sat in his home office. The room, once filled with photos of his life with Morgan, now displayed his business achievements, awards, certificates, news articles about his expanding company. His phone lit up with another text, this one from Mike. "Saw Morgan at Joe's bar. She's pretty wasted, making a scene about you." Tony replied with a simple, "Not my problem," before silencing his phone. He had an early meeting tomorrow with a potential new client, a luxury car dealership looking to outsource their maintenance work. Life was moving forward, expanding, improving. Meanwhile, Morgan's world had shrunk to a shabby apartment and a bar stool at Joe's. Her designer clothes replaced by whatever she could afford on unemployment. The next morning, Tony pulled into a shop's parking lot just as the sun was rising. The sign above the door gleamed in the early light. Marshall's Auto Repair, now servicing fleet vehicles. The new logo and expansion plans were his alone, no trace of the life he'd shared with Morgan inside. He found a handwritten note that had been slipped under the door. He recognized Morgan's increasingly unsteady handwriting. I have nothing left. Are you happy now? You got what you wanted. I'm completely alone. Even Jack won't return my calls. My own parents can barely look at me. Is this enough punishment? Please, Tony. I'm drowning here. Tony crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. Morgan was right about one thing. She had nothing left. But that had been her choice, not his. He'd simply made sure she couldn't hide from the consequences. The morning light streamed through the shop windows as Tony prepared for another successful day. In a few hours, he'd meet with the dealership executives, expanding his business even further. Meanwhile, somewhere in a rundown apartment, Morgan was waking up to another day of facing exactly what her choices had cost her. The new gym membership hadn't been Tony's idea. Mike had practically dragged him there one morning before work, insisting he needed something beyond the shop to focus on. Can't spend every waking hour with engines, boss, Mike had said. Gotta rebuild yourself too. Now, 6 months after the divorce, Tony's reflection in the gym mirror showed the results of that decision. His shoulders were broader, his waist trimmer, the physical labor of his work enhanced by dedicated training. Looking good, Marshall. Dave, one of the regular morning crew, called out. Whatever you're doing, it's working. Tony racked his weights, wiping sweat from his face. Just putting in the work, Dave. Like anything else worth doing. Speaking of work, Dave lowered his voice. Heard about Morgan getting fired from Wilson Real Estate. My wife says she showed up drunk to an open house. Not my problem anymore. Tony checked his watch. Got a meeting with that luxury dealership chain today. They're talking about exclusive service contracts for 3 locations. Dave whistled. Moving up in the world, huh? Bet Morgan's kicking herself now. If she is, she can kick herself in that roach-infested apartment she's living in. Tony grabbed his gym bag. See you tomorrow? At the shop, the changes were even more evident. New equipment lined the walls. 3 additional service bays had been added, and a sleek reception area welcomed corporate clients. The sign outside now read Marshall's Automotive Solutions, a subtle but significant upgrade from the old repair shop designation. Mike met him at the door, excitement evident in his face. Boss, you're not going to believe this. Remember that fleet contract we bid on last month? The shipping company? Tony unlocked his office. What about it? They're not just giving us their Houston fleet. Mike grinned. They want us to handle Dallas and Austin too. Said our reputation for reliability sealed the deal. Tony sat at his desk, allowing himself a small smile. Reputation matters, doesn't it? Speaking of which, heard anything about our former friend Jack lately? Mike's grin widened. Word is his wife took him for everything in the divorce. Board position, country club membership, even that precious Mercedes. Guess karma's real after all. The morning passed in a blur of meetings and paperwork. Tony had just finished signing the new fleet contract when his phone buzzed. Morgan's father's name appeared on the screen. Mr. Martinez, Tony answered coolly. What can I do for you? Anthony, this has gone far enough. The older man's voice was strained. Morgan's talking about moving to California. Says she needs a fresh start. Sounds like a good idea. Far away from here. She can't even afford the bus ticket. Everything she had is gone. Her career, her savings, her dignity. Tony leaned back in his chair. Funny how consequences work, isn't it? Kind of like how she thought nothing of destroying our marriage. She's seeing a therapist now, Mr. Martinez pressed. Working on her issues. She knows she made terrible mistakes. Mistakes? Tony cut him off. Let me tell you about mistakes. A mistake is taking a wrong turn. A mistake is overcooking dinner. What Morgan did was make choices. Deliberate, calculated choices to betray everything we built together. But this destruction of her life was her own doing. Tony's voice hardened. I just made sure everyone knew exactly who she was. Now, unless you're interested in a fleet maintenance contract, we're done here. After hanging up, Tony walked through his shop, observing the busy mechanics and steady stream of customers. The business was thriving, expanding beyond what Morgan had ever seen during their marriage. Every success felt like a vindication. That evening, he met his new business partners at Morton's Steakhouse, the same restaurant where he and Morgan had celebrated their last anniversary. The maitre d' recognized him. "Mr. Marshall, your usual table?" "Not tonight, James." Tony gestured to his guests. "We'll need the private dining room." As they discussed expansion plans over aged whiskey and prime steaks, Tony caught a glimpse of Morgan through the restaurant's front window. She was walking past, her designer clothes replaced by worn jeans and a faded blouse, her once perfect hair now dull and unkempt. She paused, looking in at the life she'd thrown away. Their eyes met for a moment through the glass. Tony raised his whiskey glass in a mock toast before turning back to his conversation about opening a new location in Dallas later that night. Driving home in his new truck, a purchase that would have been impossible during his marriage due to Morgan's spending habits, Tony passed by Joe's bar. Morgan's car, now sporting dents and a mismatched door, sat in the parking lot, his phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "She's hitting rock bottom, Tony. Spends every night here drowning her sorrows." Today she was crying about how Jack changed his number again. Tony deleted the message without responding. He had an early morning training session at the gym, followed by meetings with potential investors. His life was moving forward, expanding, improving. The next day at the gym, he overheard two women discussing Morgan while he was doing his cool-down stretches. "Can you believe she tried to get her old job back?" The first woman shook her head. "After what she did with those clients' husbands?" "I heard she's working at that discount clothing store now," her friend replied, folding the same kinds of designer clothes she used to wear. Tony moved to the weight rack, adding more plates than usual. Each rep felt like another victory, another step further from the life he'd shared with Morgan. Mike was waiting at the shop when Tony arrived, fresh from his workout. "Looking sharp, boss." Mike handed him a coffee. "Ready for the investor meeting?" Tony straightened his tie, catching his reflection in the shop window. The man looking back bore little resemblance to the one Morgan had betrayed. Stronger, more confident, successful on his own terms. "More than ready," he replied, unlocking the door. Time to show them exactly what Marshall's Automotive can do. Inside his office, Tony found another note that had been slipped under the door. Morgan's handwriting was shaky. "I see you everywhere in our old restaurants, in the stores where I used to shop, in the face of every happy couple. You've won, Tony. You've completely destroyed me. Was it worth it?" Tony dropped the note in his shredder without a second glance. He had investments to discuss, expansions to plan, a future to build. Morgan's descent into misery was her own doing. He'd simply made sure she couldn't hide from the consequences of her choices. 8 months after the divorce, Tony walked into Henderson's grocery, his mind on the custom car restoration project waiting at his shop. The vintage Mustang represented everything his business had become. High-end, exclusive, profitable. A far cry from the simple repair work he'd done during his marriage. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he navigated the familiar aisles. He'd shopped here throughout his marriage, usually rushing to grab whatever items Morgan had forgotten for her dinner parties. Now he moved at his own pace, selecting ingredients for the meals he'd learned to cook for himself, that he turned down the coffee aisle and stopped short. Morgan stood there, studying the prices on generic brands. A far cry from the premium coffee she'd insisted on during their marriage. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. Her designer clothes had been replaced by worn jeans and a faded blouse. Her once perfect hair hung limp and unwashed. Tony considered turning around, but that wasn't his style. He never backed down, never ran. He continued down the aisle, his footsteps echoing on the linoleum. Morgan's head snapped up at the sound. Her eyes widened, showing dark circles that makeup couldn't quite hide. She clutched her shopping basket tighter, its meager contents reflecting her new reality. "Tony?" Her voice trembled. I didn't expect to see you here. It's a public place." He reached past her for his preferred brand of coffee, noting how she flinched at his proximity. "You look good." Morgan's eyes traveled over his improved physique, the confident set of his shoulders, the expensive watch that had replaced their anniversary gift. "Really good. Jim does that." Tony dropped the coffee in his cart. "So does sleeping well at night." Morgan's face crumpled slightly. "Tony, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. A mistake. He turned to face her fully. Let's talk about mistakes, Morgan. A mistake is burning dinner. A mistake is missing a turn. What you did, that was a choice. Multiple choices, made over and over again. I know. Tears welled in her eyes. I know that now. I've lost everything. My job, my friends, my dignity. Even Jack. Yes, Jack. Tony's smile was cold. How is the happy family man? Oh, wait. You wouldn't know? Would you? Since his wife made him change his number. Morgan wiped at her eyes with a shaking hand. I'm seeing a therapist. Working on myself. Trying to understand why I. Spread your legs for another man in our bed? Tony's voice carried just enough to make nearby shoppers turn their heads. Save the therapy talk. You didn't need therapy to decide to cheat. You don't need it to live with the consequences. Please. Morgan stepped closer, lowering her voice. I'm drowning here. I can barely afford rent. I'm working retail. She gestured helplessly at her basket of generic brands and discount items. This isn't me. Actually, it is you. Tony's voice was matter-of-fact. This is exactly who you are without someone else to leech off of. Without the lifestyle my work provided while you were busy screwing around, a woman with a cart passed by, doing a poor job of hiding her interest in their conversation. Morgan's face flushed with shame. I made a mistake, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. No, Morgan. Tony shook his head. You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. Now live with it. He turned away, pushing his cart toward the checkout. Behind him, he heard a choked sob, but he didn't look back. Morgan had chosen her path. Now she could walk it alone to the register. Tony caught his reflection in the security mirror. Confident, successful, strong. 8 months ago, he discovered his wife's betrayal in their bed. Today, he was building an automotive empire while she struggled to afford generic coffee outside. The Houston sun beat down on the parking lot. Tony loaded his groceries into his new truck, the one he'd bought to celebrate landing the dealership contract. From the corner of his eye, he saw Morgan emerge from the store, clutching her single plastic bag of cheap necessities. She paused, looking in his direction, but Tony was already sliding behind the wheel. He had a custom Mustang waiting at his shop, a business empire to build, a life to live. Morgan was nothing more than a cautionary tale. A reminder of why loyalty mattered. The drive back to his shop took him past familiar landmarks. The hotel where Morgan had met Jack, the restaurants where they'd celebrated anniversaries, the church where they'd exchanged vows she'd so easily broken. Each place held memories, but they no longer had power over him. Mike was waiting at the shop, examining the Mustang's engine. How's she looking? Tony asked, setting his groceries in his office. Better than Morgan, from what I hear. Mike wiped his hands on a rag. Lisa says she's taking the bus to Dallas next week. Moving in with her parents. Tony nodded, unsurprised. Running away. Typical Morgan. Always looking for someone else to fix her problems. You really never going to forgive her? Nothing to forgive. Tony ran his hand along the Mustang's pristine bodywork. Forgiveness is for mistakes. She made choices. Now she gets to live with them. The afternoon sun streamed through the shop windows, glinting off the Mustang's fresh paint. Tony stood there for a moment, taking in everything he'd built. The expanded business, the new contracts, the reputation for excellence. All of it earned through hard work and integrity. The very things Morgan had thrown away for cheap thrills with Jack. Later that evening, Tony stood in his backyard, watching the sunset. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Morgan's latest attempt to reach him. Saw you today. You've done well for yourself. I know now what I threw away. I'll never forgive myself. Leaving for Dallas tomorrow. Goodbye, Tony. He deleted the message without responding and blocked the number. Inside his house. Earned through his work, he poured himself a whiskey and walked into his home office. The wall of achievements had grown. Business awards, news articles about Marshall's automotive solutions, photos of restored classic cars that didn't owe traces remained of his life with Morgan. She destroyed their marriage with her choices, and now she would live with the consequences. Tony had rebuilt himself, stronger and more successful than ever. The betrayal hadn't destroyed him. It had revealed his true strength. While Morgan fled to Dallas, running from the wreckage of her choices, Tony stood triumphant in the life he'd built from the ashes of her betrayal. He raised his glass to his reflection in the window, a silent toast to the man he'd become. The man who'd faced betrayal head-on and emerged victorious. The man who'd shown Morgan exactly what she'd thrown away. The sun set on Houston, painting the sky in shades of victory.